Okay, last week we learned that after 7 years, Joshua ended all-out war on Canaan and rested. Don't think that means all the fighting was over in Canaan Land. In fact, one way to look at the Bible is the fighting has continued and will continue for 3,500 years until Revelation reveals Jesus conquering the whole world and becoming the King of Kings for the whole earth. We're going to go over a bunch of people were left that were alive, and they were supposed to be killed according to God, but they got tired of fighting. They ran away from them and hid, and they didn't go root them out. But what they did is they took the land good enough so where they could hold the land. But they've still got these pockets of giants and pagans with idol worship and altars and stuff in the land. Well, they're not supposed to have any altars, not one. No idols at all. But what they did is they're kind of making a covenant with them. They're saying, well, you stay over there and I'll stay over here. That don't last no time at all. So we're going to find that even though God told them to kill every one of them, they started living with them. And then they started making covenant with them, intermarrying with them, worshiping their idols. And so for 3,500 more years until the very end, when Jesus comes to clean it all out, that's how long it's lasted. And see, the Palestinians are Philistines. The Philistines, all the coast, here we can look on here, all the way up to Tyre up here, all the way down this coast. There's the Philistines are here, and let's see, I don't remember what was in here, but then you got Phoenicia up here. But all of this was left. They never attacked anybody in here. So all of these people on the coast are left. And see, Gaza is where the giants went. That's where sons of Anak are. And so you got Hebron, that's got a bunch of Anakim in it, which is Anak. And then over here you've got the Geshurites, and here's Moab and Edom, Edomites right here. This is right next to these people. Now, this right here is the promised land, this way. Over here was not really considered the promised land, but Moses took these tribes right here and he gave them to East Manasseh and Gad and Reuben. So that's 2.5 tribes. And over here you got Manasseh and Ephraim over here too. So all of this right here is Canaan land. This is what God's promised land was. This is kind of an add-on over here. All of these people are living next to the bad people. Up here you've got the Geshurites, and down here you've got the Amorites and the Edomites.
That's the same thing we're going through today. You can't accept sin because it's going to bleed over on you.
Right, God knew. He said, I'm going to give you my rules and you'll live by my rules. And they said, yes sir, we will. And then the first thing you know, they're over worshiping idols, marrying their women and all that. See, a lot of people look at Jews as racist because they weren't allowed to intermarry. They weren't allowed to even talk.
Well, that's what we used to tell the kids. Now, be careful when you go to school, because watch who you hang with.
Right.
Because that's what happens.
Well, God told them, don't intermarry with these people, because what will happen is the woman will make the man start worshiping her gods. So she had more pull than a man would have. We will read about the judges fighting these same people. See, right after Joshua is judges. And who they fight? They have to fight the giants. Then Saul was given orders to go kill I think it was Amorites. He didn't do it. And so he pronounced him to be dead, and David was going to be the next king. Okay? Then David and many lesser known kings of Israel up to today in the Palestinian conflicts. So when we're fighting the Palestinians in Israel, they're fighting Philistines. And how important are Philistines? If you read the Old Testament, it's always us, Israel against the Philistines all the time. So they gave them heck all the time. Well, they lived down here in Judah.
The Philistines was giants.
Yeah. That's what we're going to find out here is they left giants in certain places. And see, Joshua he asked God for a special place, and he wanted Hebron, because that's where all the bones were. See, the Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all these other people were buried in Hebron. Well, that's full of giants. So here he is, an 85-year-old man. He asked to get Hebron, and God gave it to him, and he had to clean it out. What you're going to find is that every piece of land that these tribes get, there's some giants that left in it, and they're expected to clean it out and finish the job, and they don't ever do it, ever. Okay. We will look at the verses, but I see no need in printing them out. What they're saying is an account of what was done in the first 11 chapters of Joshua. It starts with an accounting of the kingdoms overthrown by Moses. Many don't realize that Moses defeated several kingdoms on the east side of the Jordan River before he died, not being allowed to cross the Jordan into the promised land. In truth, Canaan Land was thought to be on the west side of the Jordan. Moses awarded Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh on the east side of the Jordan. The two main kingdoms of the three overthrown by Moses were Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan. What I find noteworthy here is they were both associated with giants. So they give you three places, the main places that Moses overthrew before they went into the Canaan land, and they were full of giants. Og, the king of Bashan, will appear again and again in scriptures and symbolize the land of demons. Whenever we read about Bashan, we ought to think demons. Og, demons, or giants. They were known to be bulls. They were known for their bulls, and bulls were worshipped in many pagan territories like Egypt. Also, we learned that the beast of the field, are bulls. So everything to do with Bashan is demonic. Okay. In Psalms 22, Jesus was seeing in the spirit while on the cross, and saw bulls surrounding himself. Many of these giants passed themselves off as gods to their people, as they were different than most humans. Psalm 22:12. Many bulls have surrounded me. Strong bulls of Bashan have encircled me. So this is David writing a psalm, and he is seeing what Jesus is going to see when he's on the cross. And he sees many bulls surrounding him. Well, people say, well, why would he see bulls surrounding him? He's seeing demonic spiritual beings, is what he's seeing. From Joshua 12, 7 through 24, we get an account of the kingdoms Joshua overthrew on the west bank of the Jordan River. They are listed in order as they were overthrown. In verse 24, Scripture states that a total was 31 kings. Any way I count them, even with Moses and Joshua together, they don't add up to 31. They're counting even some minor kings that aren't listed. So if you read it'll give a list of all of the kingdoms that were overthrown. They don't add up to 31. But then he says they overthrew 31. So there must be some left out.
Major, minor ones.
Exactly. They must have left some out that were minor kingdoms. What we see here in chapter 12 is a large portion of Canaan was conquered, but not all of it. It was enough, however, for them to take control of it and divide it up amongst the tribes. We need to remember that over 7 years of war, Israel had no crops except for what they took from the defeated. Many of their soldiers were really artists, laborers, farmers, and unskilled in war. It was time for Israel to divvy up the land and farm for themselves. Another thing to keep in mind here is that Joshua was God's man for Israel, but was not to become a king. God never wanted a king for his people. He wanted to be the king of the people.
Right.
So the next thing we see is judges are over the land to settle disputes. And then they finally got Saul. God is to be our king. And they never wanted a king, and Saul was their first king. He didn't turn out so good. What country has 3 million followers, a large army, successfully conquered a large country, and did not claim to be king? God was to be their king, and Joshua would just be another person among the people. The tribes would have patriarchs, but every family would be free to handle their land as possible. Every land that had a king, the king was their God and refused to follow Jehovah. Every time you have somebody that takes over, they start wanting you to worship them. Okay? Judges were about to set up rule over disputes, but God did not want a king for his people. When Saul was made king, trouble started when Saul refused to follow Jehovah. Kings would always demand more from the people than they gave back to the people. No matter how good a person you make a king, they always demand more from the people then he gives back to them, because he's setting himself up as the head honcho. At the time the land was to be divided up, Philistia, part of Gaza, Phoenicia, and a tribe called the Geshurites next to East Manasseh had not been conquered. The Geshurites intertwined with Israel and eventually led them into idolatry, intermarriage, and rebellion. The Philistines are a perpetual enemy of Israel and is where the Palestinians come from today. Gaza is where many giants settled, and they were home of Goliath and his brothers. For whatever reason, Joshua did not bother to conquer the coastlands yet. So over down in here, this is Gaza, and this is where the giants are right along here. And then you have the Philistines here, and then you have the Phoenicians up here. Okay, chapter 13, the inheritance of East Jordan. Now that was talking about the lands that hadn't been conquered yet. So now we're going to talk about east of the Jordan. This chapter is just a more detailed report on who got what in the land east of the Jordan. When you start reading these verses, it gets kind of boring because it'll say you go from this rock to this tree, over to this river, down to here. And they may not even exist today, but they've come up with close enough borders to where they can make a map that kind of sort of looks like what they divided the land up. But unless you're studying the history of the tribes and stuff, it's like, for my purposes, I want to look at prophecy and meaningful things in the Bible, not a borderline or something, you know. I'm sure somebody might get into a border dispute, and you might want to go look at the line where it is and how they messed up or something, but I'm not going to get that deep into it. By now we know that the half-tribe of Manasseh was furthest north. Gad was below them, with Reuben furthest south. Geshurites lived next to East Manasseh. Ammonites lived next to Gad, with Moabites and Edomites next to Reuben. Being surrounded by enemies, these 2.5 tribes were always attacked first and were always harassed, while the west side of the Jordan had warning before an attack. In other words, if you look up here, all their attackers are over here, and they're going to come in this way. So they were surrounded by bad people all over here. Now, if say Manasseh got attacked, then Manasseh over here would know about it. All these tribes would be ready for it because they would have already heard about it. See? So, especially being up against the water. But the problem is the one next to the water already had the enemy in it. So they had to get rid of those. But everywhere, especially Moab and Edomites, they had to come over here. They could cross over and come into Negev. This is the Negev Desert here. This is pitiful, poor land. It's like what you would imagine Sodom and Gomorrah was after the blast. There's not a blade of grass for miles in some places. So they got kind of a raw deal down here. Being surrounded by enemies, these 2.5 tribes were always attacked first and were always harassed, while the west side of the Jordan had a warning before an attack. These 2.5 tribes thought they were fortunate to get land before the fighting on the west side of the Jordan even started, but it proved challenging when the fighting ended. So they felt like they, got the good deal, because when Moses was there, they already took over the eastern side over here and said, "This is my land, we'll get here." And then they said, "Well, I'll let you have it if you'll go help them take the land on the west side of the Jordan." So they said, "Well, however long it takes, we'll do that." So they made an agreement, but they had to fight 7 years before they could even go home and visit their families or anything. Another thing to remember about the divisions of land between the east and the west was the west side was divided between 10 tribes instead of 12, which gave more land to the 10. So these are just basically bigger. So you got some over here that's really intricate and small, these little pieces here. So they had 10 tribes to divide this up, and they had 2.5 over here. So you have East Manasseh and West Manasseh is the problem. They got the most land out of everybody, and of course Judah got the other. But they had all this land here to divide up amongst 10 people, and over here you had only 3. Okay. In verse 6, God makes it clear that Joshua is to divide the land right now. Joshua was over 85, and his fighting days were over. God made it clear that he himself would drive out the leftovers from Israel. Could that mean that he will be the one that finally clears out the enemies of God's people in the last days? I put that in there myself because in verse 6, let's just read it. 13:6. Then I will drive out from before the children of Israel, only divide it by lot to Israel as an inheritance I have commanded you. So he is saying, do it now before you die. I want it all straightened out, and I will drive out the enemies. Well, he hadn't driven them out. So I think that's talking about the last days. He's going to come down and finish it. Chapter 13 is generally all about the inheritance Moses had already given to the 2.5 tribes on the east side of the Jordan. If we remember back when this was done, Moses made them swear to send their military men with the other 9.5 tribes to fight as long as Joshua needed them. Well, now was the time for them to separate themselves and go home to their families. Moses gave them the land as he had decreed, but Joshua will settle the land divisions by lots on the west side of the Jordan. So Moses divided up the land over on the east side, but they're going to draw lots for the west side. Most of the verses in chapter 13 are just boundary lines as they would have described them back in the day, and the location of the remnant of the giants. But every once in a while, it'll give up some prophetical information that will prove useful later on. Verse 13 is one such verse. Joshua 13:13. Nevertheless, the children of Israel did not drive out the Geshurites, or the Machanites, or the Geshurites, and the Machanites dwell among the Israelites even to this day. Now these two, the Geshurites and the Machanites, become Assyria later. What do we know about Assyria? They skinned people alive. So here these barbarians are living amongst them, and they end up taking the northern tribes later on in their history. It's very bad. Assyria was very cruel, and they would skin them alive and tack their skins up on the walls. People could identify their relatives up on the walls. That's where terrorism comes from today, is these, what are they called, Geshurites and Machanites. Everywhere there were remnants of these pagan leftovers, they would remain an irritant to Israel even to this day. Everywhere these pagans were left intact, that would be the place where the idol worship and wars broke out even to this day. There are dozens and dozens of stories throughout Scripture where Israel fell into sin and idol worship along with intermarrying and unprofitable covenants with their enemies. The Geshurites and the Machanites eventually formed the empire of Assyria and later would conquer the northern kingdom when it was called Israel, and the southern kingdom was called Judah. Happens a little later when they all lose their identity, and there's a line drawn east to west. And the northern kingdom is going to be Ephraim, and the southern kingdom is going to be Judah. Now Ephraim is called Israel. So it's the house of Israel is the northern kingdom. These all have separate names. You have to kind of get them down in your mind. And be careful when you're reading in the Old Testament, because it may say the house of Israel, and it really means the northern kingdom. And another name would be Ephraim. They leave Manasseh completely out, because you remember the cross-handed blessing. Okay? So the two main tribes are going to be Ephraim and Judah. That's how it's going to come out. All the rest of them are also rams. They don't make the big picture. There's a story after story in Scriptures that show that if Israel had only done what God told them to do, it would have saved countless lives and misery in the future. Babylon is described in detail in Scripture, and we know it's the enemy of God, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and his people. But we don't recognize it as Babylon because it's not called Babylon today. When you find out it murdered its own children and had rampant sexual deviancy and worshipped multiple gods, we can start to see it manifest today under other names. Now, Babylon was totally destroyed. There's nothing but a heap of stones over there. And if you'll remember, Saddam Hussein was rebuilding it, and he wanted to be the head of Babylon. But it's just a pile of stones. There's nothing over there anymore. But they took over the southern kingdom of Judah. Okay, but anyway, you can recognize it through abortion, sexual deviancy and worshiping multiple gods. Another interesting verse comes in verse 22. We find out that Balaam being killed. Now, I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with Balaam and Balak. Okay, it's in Numbers 22 is where, if you want to read it. Joshua 13:22, the children of Israel also killed with the sword Balaam, the son of Beor, the soothsayer, among those who were killed by them. Notice he's not called a prophet. They believe that he's a Gentile prophet. He heard from God and he spoke God's word, but he sold it. He would give you an oracle of God if you paid him. If you read about him, Balak hired him to curse Israel, and he couldn't do it. He would go over there and get ready to curse them, and his mouth would move, and he would bless them. And he ended up, Balak offered him half of his kingdom, which was like more gold than you could spend in your lifetime, and he couldn't do it. So, and if you go to Revelation, there's a church that has the spirit of Balak in it, or Balaam, selling it, cheapening it. Balaam was a non-Israelite character back in Numbers 22 that talked to God and God talked to him. But he didn't have the good of Israel in his heart. He basically sold his services to the highest bidder. For me, his death was recorded to show that your sin will catch up with you eventually. God caused him to say only what God told him to say. So even when Balak told him to curse Israel, he could not repeat it with his mouth. So he ended up blessing Israel. An interesting prophecy to come from Balaam is found in Numbers 24:17. Now this is one of his prophecies. He was told to go curse Israel, and this is what came out of his mouth. I see him, capital H, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, that's Israel. A scepter shall rise out of Israel, that's control, that's authority. And batter and the brow of Moab, and destroy all the sons of tumult. And Edom shall be a possession. Seir, also his enemies, shall be a possession, while Israel does valiantly. So he's predicting the birth of Christ, and he's blessing Israel, and he was paid to curse Israel. Balak had paid him to curse Israel, yet it appears God gave him a vision of the coming Messiah. Balaam is mentioned several times in the New Testament. Balaam knew he received his visions from God, yet he sold out to the highest bidder. Most believe he was a Gentile seer and not Jewish. Does this prove God will reveal himself to Gentiles as well as Jews? So, you see, we could have had non-Jewish prophets if they would have just been dedicated to God instead of their pagan gods. He is mentioned in Revelation 2 in the church of Pergamum. Revelation 2:14. But I have a few things against you, because you have there those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit sexual immorality. So he's talking about a church in the future is going to have the spirit of Balaam in it. So the spirit of Balaam is to read things not godly and commit sexual immorality. Is that happening in any churches today? Another iconic story of Balaam is found in Numbers 22. I find it interesting that Balaam could see the future but couldn't see right in front of him. The angel of the Lord stood with his sword in front of Balaam, and his donkey turned aside in the path. Balaam hit the donkey 3 separate times, and the donkey spoke to Balaam. This angel, capital A, if you go back to Numbers 22, talks about an angel, it's going to be a capital A angel. He's going to have his sword drawn. And what does that remind you of? Joshua 5, when he saw the man with the sword drawn. Okay? But he couldn't see him. The donkey could see him, and he would turn away. So he would beat the donkey and try to get him to go up the trail, and he wouldn't go any further up the trail because you had an angel with a sword standing in the trail. He said, I'm not going there. So finally the donkey told him, why are you hitting me? The donkey talked, okay? This angel, capital A, made himself visible to Balaam and spoke to him. Balaam fell to the ground and worshipped the angel, Notice the angel didn't object to his worship. So this was one of those times where he didn't say, get up, don't worship me.
Yeah.
So this was a capital A angel, okay? Making himself visible. Jesus could be right here, and we couldn't see him. And when he makes himself visible,
Well,
he can be seen.
he promised us that.
Well,
He said that where two or more gathered together, there goes the midst of it.
Exactly.
That means he is right here.
exactly. What did Jesus do to the Pharisees? He would get away from them. They would come to stone him, and he would just disappear and go somewhere else.
Right.
But I thought it was kind of neat that here's Balaam not knowing why his donkey was giving him trouble, and then he let himself be seen. So that's the kind of dimension, the world that God lives in, is he can make himself visible, or he can hide himself.
Said when he met the disciples, went across the lake in the boat, and he met them halfway, and immediately they was on the other side.
Right,
And he showed up in the boat, and they was already in the middle of the lake when he showed up in the boat.
right. See, we talk about miracles, you know, like healing the blind and raising the dead and everything. But a lot of times when it just says he was there, we don't really think about that. But he is able to transport himself miraculously anywhere he wants to go. And he walks through walls. He had that ability even before he died. You know, we talk about him coming to see Thomas and everything, and all of a sudden the doors are locked and everything, and he's in the room. Well, he could do that when he was alive too. So, we don't think about this kind of stuff until it just hits you. Numbers 22:31. Then the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand, and he bowed his head and fell flat on his face. And the angel of the Lord said to him, why have you struck your donkey these 3 times? Behold, I have come out to stand against you, because your way is perverse before me. So he's chewing him out, and he's stopping it right here. That I'm not putting up with another inch of this. The donkey saw me and turned aside from me in these 3 times. If she had not turned aside from me, surely I would have also killed you by now and let her live. So he's saying, you're not going any further. I don't.
Why didn't he see the
Well,
angel?
the donkey could see, but he couldn't see. Like, God can do these things.
Well,
So that's right. When I was studying this set of verses here and everything to see what was going on, I said, man, he could be anywhere and then show himself to you. And like I said, animals can see him, and we can't. So it's kind of neat. It's another dimension of God that we don't dwell on very much. Okay, verse 34. And Balaam said to the angel of the Lord, I have sinned, for I did not know you stood in the way against me. Now therefore, if it displeases you, I will turn back. So he's easy to work with right now. Then the angel of the Lord said to Balaam, go with the men, but only the word that I speak you shall speak. So he's telling them, go on, do what you're supposed to do, but tell them what I'm going to tell you. Don't give them any other advice. So Balaam went with the princes of Balak. Notice the angel was seen with his sword drawn, just as the man was seen by Joshua in Joshua 5:13. This was not a typical angel because he was allowed to be worshipped. The new information I got was that he had the ability to be seen and then unseen, even though the donkey saw him. Anyway, Balaam was killed there in the battle because you can't serve God and mammon. Okay, and if you remember the advice that when he finally gave up and stopped prophesying for Balak, he told him what he knew that would work against Israel. He said, parade your women around half-dressed and walk around in front of the Israelites. Pretty soon you'll have them. And that's what happened. That's why he was killed. He was working for the enemy. But every time that they paid him to give them an oracle from God, he couldn't do it. But then he just said, well, what am I supposed to do if you can't give me what I want? And he said, just parade your women around half naked in front of the Israelites. Pretty soon you'll own them. And that happened, and they were taken over. Now as we see how the land is divided up, it would be a worthwhile exercise to return to Genesis 49 and Deuteronomy 33 to review the prophecy spoken over the children of Jacob. It would be a great study, but for us today it is just a bunch of rabbit trails to delay the finish of Joshua. So if y'all have time for homework in Genesis 49, you could go back and see how the tribes were divided up and see if the prophecy came true and how it looked. Most of these verses reveal the division lines of the tribal areas, which we will skip for now. We learn also that the Levites were not given any land, but were divided among the cities. Chapter 14, Caleb's land. Now, if you remember, when they had the spies go out, Joshua and Caleb were the two that gave the good report. So Joshua became the leader of the tribes of the warriors, and Caleb got his own land here. He's a special person, okay? The main information in chapter 14 is the land Caleb asked Joshua for personally. If we remember back in Numbers, Caleb was one of the two spies that came back to Moses with a good report on the land God was going to give them. The reason Joshua and Caleb gave a good report was they believed God that he would deliver the land to them even if the land was full of man-eating giants. Chapter 14 is also the place where we find out how long Joshua fought the Canaanites. We find out that Caleb was 40 at the time of the spying out of the land, and now he is 85 at the end of the fighting. 40 plus 38 years of wandering plus 7 years of fighting equals 85. Caleb asked for Hebron, and Joshua gave it to him. The rest of the distributions were done by drawing lots. Hebron was full of giants. Joshua 14:12. Now therefore give me this mountain of which the Lord spoke that day, for you heard that day how the Anakim were there, and the cities were great and the fortified. And it may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall be able to drive them out, as the Lord said. The Anakim were giants, and Caleb knew God would help him drive them out from the land. Verse 15. And the name of Hebron formerly was Kirjath Arba. Arba was the greatest man among the Anakim. Then the land would rest from war. Caleb was from the tribes of Judah, and Judah will be handled in chapter 15. Arba was the father of Anak, and Anak had 3 sons at this time in Hebron. Later we'll see Goliath will be called a son of Anak, with 4 brothers that come out of Gaza. These giants will last long into the future. Israel has killed enough to take and hold the land, but we will see that the ridding of the land of the enemies of God and his people are still going on today, and will end when Jesus comes back to handle it himself. Caleb was from the tribe of Judah, and Joshua was from Ephraim, and Caleb was from Judah. So there's the 2 main players right there. They're the ones that are going to end up in the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Chapter 15, the allotment for Judah. Out of the 12 tribes of Jacob, Judah and Joseph were the 2 most important spiritually. Judah would be the tribe that provided the DNA for the coming Messiah, and Joseph would provide the 2 adopted spiritual sons of the Gentiles that would represent the spiritual bride of the coming Christ. Chapter 15 tells us about the inheritance of Judah, and chapter 16 speaks of the allotment for the Ephraim and Manasseh. So the DNA for Jesus is going to come from Judah, but the bride is going to come from Ephraim. I thought that was neat how that worked out. It will be very significant to remember in the future studies that we know that Caleb was one from the tribe of Judah and Joshua was from the tribe of Ephraim. These were the 2 spies with the good report in the promised land, and Ephraim was the younger brother of Manasseh that was blessed with the cross hand blessing for the Gentile children of Joseph. After the split of the tribes in the future, there will be 2 territories called Judah for the southern kingdom and Ephraim for the name of the northern kingdom. Manasseh will have 2 plots of land, which will give him the firstborn double portion of the land, though Ephraim was made firstborn ceremonially. So there's all kinds of firstborn passing out here of land. But Manasseh got the most land because he got the double portion, but Ephraim got the double portion by being the firstborn ceremonially. Okay, he's the one that has the bride coming. Joseph received a double portion by his sons being adopted by Jacob as the sons to get equal inheritance. So Joseph got his double inheritance because he was the favorite of Jacob by having two sons get land. Judah was the first lot drawn in the west side of the Jordan. Caleb was the first clan given land, and Caleb asked for Hebron, a land that hadn't been fully conquered yet of giants. The plots of land given out usually had unconquered lands in it that they would be expected to finish taking. Like I said, each one of these tribes has unconquered lands. They have trouble in their midst, and they were supposed to go take care of it. Didn't do it. None of the coastlands were fully conquered, and much would remain unconquered for a long time. Caleb offered his daughter to anyone that could kill the giants in Debir. Caleb killed the giants in Hebron, but had difficulty taking Debir. Caleb's brother killed the giants in Debir, so Caleb gave his daughter to his brother for a wife. So his daughter married the uncle. Okay? The truth is there were many Canaanites left in the country that weren't defeated, and Israel ended up compromising with them, making covenants and intermarrying. This is just an example of many similar verses. So this, I'm just using this as an example. Joshua 15:63. As for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the children of Judah could not drive them out, but the Jebusites dwell with the children of Judah at Jerusalem to this day. So the Jebusites, Jebus was the name of Jerusalem before it became Jerusalem. So the Jebusites lived in Jerusalem, and they couldn't drive them out, even though they fought them for years. Well, they ended up just calling it a draw. One thing we know is Joshua and Caleb were men of God that believed what he had said about delivering Canaan into their hands. They had faith. Israel as a whole, however, made covenants with them, intermarried with them, and participated in the evil that was in Canaan. As Christians, we need to understand that God doesn't tolerate evil amongst his people. They are to be holy. There is no compromise in heaven with evil, and he expects the same on earth. In my opinion, the stubborn nature of the pagan non-believers remaining embedded in Israel after they were conquered shows lack of faith and disobedience to his commands. Leaving them alive and leaving their idols and altars intact showed unwillingness to have faith in God and put their newly conquered land in jeopardy. Israel will be doomed to war and threat until the last days, where Jesus comes to finally rescue them from their unbelief. Next week we'll continue to see the distributions of the land, but it will go very fast as we will concentrate only on prophetic verses and other consequential information. We'll need to remember that Israel has changed over the centuries, and some maps of this time will vary map to map.